Welcome back. I'm Dr. Cheek and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how do I manage my anxiety by using the what if. What if we take ourselves down that proverbial rabbit hole of what ifs and all of the questions, all of the assumptions? How do I use that to manage my anxiety? Anxiety tends to be a product of our thoughts and the way we think about things that are happening around us or situations that are happening around us. And we tend to think about them in different ways. And here are about 3 different ways that we create worry and anxiety for ourselves in a given situation. Are there others? Yes, but these are the 3 that tend to be most prevalent for most individuals. So, first way that we tend to create worry for ourselves in our lives is when we have things that we have the ability to change, but we don't know how we want them to change. So we know what needs to change. We know what we want to be different, but we don't know what we want to be different about it. We know what is not working for us. We know how it's not working for us. But if ever asked what would need to be different in order for this to work, we don't have the answer to that question. Or we worry about the things that we cannot control spiraling further outside of our control and us losing our ability to manage certain aspects of our lives. Or we worry about past negative experiences repeating themselves and us not being able to do anything to avoid repeating those same past negative experiences or repeating those same mistakes in the future. Those are the things that we tend to worry about. And there tends to be what if questions that come along with that tends to fuel that anxiety for us. So what would happen if we followed that what if train of thought fully to help manage our anxiety? Let's take a moment to discuss what ifs typically look like in most case scenarios that create that anxiety. And then let's talk about how we can manage that anxiety by following that what if train of thought. Now, what if tends to have 3 main possible scenarios that could come from the thought process we're having or the anxiety that we're having because we are uncertain about what the outcome will be, but we are assuming certain scenarios that either feed into or lessen the anxiety we're feeling. So we are either thinking of best case scenario. Then the best case scenario is truly what we want to happen, but it's the thing that typically tends to be less likely to happen for different reasons. Maybe we are romanticizing or fantasizing about what we want the outcome to be, but the fantasy and the romanticized version is not something that's truly possible. But that's the best case scenario, and we can think about that. But we rarely allow ourselves to think about the best case scenario because we feel like that's less likely to happen. However, we more than likely tend to think about the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is the worst possible outcome that we can assume to happen, including death. That is also less likely to happen, but it feels more reasonable and it creates the greatest level of anxiety. For this particular thought, which is typically the thought that we have, is a thought that we ruminate on, it's a thought that continues to run through our minds, is the worst case scenario when we're dealing with an unknown or uncertain situation. And this is what tends to drive the most anxiety-provoking what-if questions, and this is the scenario that tends to create the greatest level of anxiety for us. And that last scenario that we sometimes kind of focus on or touch bases on, but we don't give a lot of space to or time to actually process, is the most likely case. And the most likely case is built on the reality of the situation, our understanding of the players of that situation, and the most likely outcome given our understanding of what's happening around us. Is what will realistically happen given the circumstances in the situation that we tend to overlook in most cases. Because in the moment, that feels too simple for some of us. In the moment, that doesn't feel as likely as the worst case scenario. But even if we think in the most likely case, that could also lead to some level of anxiety, even if we think of the reality of a situation. But the anxiety, instead of being on 10, is now at a 2. So even in the most likely of situations, based on the reality of the situations and circumstances, it can create some uncomfortable anxiety, but the anxiety is not as intense or elevated. So let's take an example of how do we do this what if process. So let's take an example, common sometimes in relationships is, let's say your significant other is starting to come home late 1 to 2 days a week, same days each week. Now, best case scenario, Best case scenario is the optimistic, hopeful aspect that you could tell yourself as to what is happening, as to why your spouse is not coming home on time. So best case scenario may sound like or look like you saying, my significant other is taking classes. I told them 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago that I wanted to go and learn how to dance. I know they don't know how to dance, so maybe they're taking dance classes so they can surprise me with a dance trip. Or maybe they are working overtime, so now we can plan this vacation that we've been planning for months or years. That's the best case scenario. Is that likely? Depending on your relationship, that's likely. But for most of us, sometimes that's not likely. And sometimes we, in these best case scenarios, we create optimism that is not realistic. And the emotions that may come with that, even if the thoughts are realistic, is it could lead to feelings of excitement, feeling elated, feeling overjoyed. You may start to make purchases in order to plan for this trip that you think is going to happen, or this event that you think is going to happen based off of whatever you are deeming or thinking is what your significant other is doing. So that's the best case scenario. Now, we have the worst case scenario. In worst case scenario, we all know what that is. Worst case scenario is my significant other is cheating. They're using this time after work to spend time with someone else. So let's go down this proverbial rabbit hole of what ifs in this worst case scenario, which causes this greater level of anxiety. So what if your significant other is cheating on you? Then you have some options. So either you can stay and ignore the fact that you think they're cheating, leave and say cheating is a deal breaker for me, stay, work on the relationship, or you can respond based off your emotions. What are your emotions saying? How are you feeling? You may feel betrayed. You may feel angry. You may feel sadness. You may feel disappointed. You may feel disgusted. If your significant other is cheating and you feel these emotions, so what if I feel this way? Well, I might want to call and curse their mom out and curse the day she ever gave birth to them. Take my frustrations out on their property, whether it's their clothes or their vehicle. I bust the windows out your car. And though it didn't mend my broken heart, I probably always have these ugly scars. But right now I don't care about that part. I bust the windows out your car. Take the first scenario that I'm using my emotions to decide how I want to respond. If I take that road, what if I get so angry that I call and curse their parents out? Well, likely outcome of that, you know your significant other well enough to know how they will respond to you or being mean or rude or disrespectful to their loved ones. That might mean the end of your relationship. It might lead to further disagreements. That might lead to the dissolution of your relationship or your family or whatever dynamic you have with that partner. Other side to that, allowing my emotions to take control and respond simply based off how I'm feeling, of damaging property. My significant other could press charges. I could end up in jail. I could lose my job. I could lose access to my children. All of these things can happen. So this is what it would look like if we follow the what if train. What if my spouse is cheating? What if I start to feel these overwhelming emotions? How do I respond to these overwhelming emotions? Do I decide because of how I'm feeling to respond solely off my emotions? Do I make a rational decision of saying I am done with this relationship and saying this is the end? Do I make a rational decision and say I am willing to stay and ignore that this is happening? Am I making a rational decision to say I am willing to stay as long as we're willing to work on this infidelity? Keep in mind, these are all assumptions. But now your anxiety, which was initially at a 10, has started to lessen because now you have a plan. Now you have ideas. Now you know what you're planning on doing. If this is the worst case scenario, you follow the what if out of all the possible outcomes that you could think of in those moments. And what are the consequences to those outcomes? So that's how we follow the what if train, but we still haven't given space to the most likely case scenario. So now that we've addressed the best case scenario, the most optimistic case scenario, we've addressed the worst case scenario. Now let's think about what is the most realistic scenario? What is the most realistic possibility of the assumption or the what if that we're having? And that most realistic, most basic what if or scenario that we could have is that your significant other has been doing something that they told you about maybe 2 weeks ago that was coming up, that they needed to work late at work and you just didn't recall. Or they are taking classes that they've been meaning to take and they have just neglected to let you know that that was going to happen. Or some other explanation that makes sense as to why your significant other is now coming home at least 2 days a week at the same time, but later than they normally do. And in this scenario, what we may feel as far as emotions are concerned, we may feel still a little bit disappointed. We may feel a little upset, or we may feel indifferent. We may feel curious. We may feel a little bit worried, a little bit concerned because we don't know. And in this case, because our emotions aren't as elevated, we still have some level of anxiety. But even with that level of anxiety, that then may turn into us, instead of maybe having these optimistic thoughts or buying things because we feel like this amazing plan is going to happen, or having the worst case thoughts. So now we're thinking about, what if I have to retaliate if this is the end of my relationship? Now we can have those thoughts of, what's actually happening? Why are they coming home late? And because of that, now my behavior may look like me simply asking, what's happening? Why are you coming home late? Did something change? Is this something you told me about that I missed or I've forgotten? Or is it something that you have missed or forgotten to tell me about? And then from there, you can have a different thought process, a different experience with your significant other that may not lead to you being disappointed because the best case scenario didn't pan out, may not lead to you having to have unnecessary consequences because you reacted to your worst possible thoughts. It can be simply, this is how I'm thinking, this is how I'm feeling. Now, how do I want to behave? How do I want to respond to the situation that's not solely based off my emotions, but also based off some rational thought that I may be having? Now, what I hope you take from this video is this. We tend to worry about things in our environment that we are unsure of. This could be a situation that causes some level of anxiety because we don't know all of the possibilities. There is some level of uncertainty. There is some level of unknown that we either have to find out or we may never find out. And those things feel uncomfortable, which is what creates the anxiety. Sometimes in certain situations, where we have the ability to understand or know what the outcome has the ability to be, we may want to follow that what if train of thought to an inevitable point. So that might look like I'm following my what if thought completely till I get to the consequences of whatever behavioral choice or action I feel like I want to implement. If I continue to follow this what if thought process, am I getting to a place where I now have a plan, even in the worst case scenario? Am I finding that I'm always holding on to the worst case scenario? And when I'm holding on to the worst case scenario, what tends to pan out or what tends to happen is it turns out to be the most likely case scenario. So maybe I need to now rethink how I think about certain uncertain situations. So there are times in our lives when that anxiety will be heightened. It could be because of changes that are happening, changes that we aren't expecting to happen. It could be the unknown. It could be feeling like we have the fear of the past repeating itself. There are a number of things that creates and elevates the anxiety for us. And sometimes we can use the what if line of questioning completely and thoroughly to get to a place where we have examined most of the possibilities and most of the outcomes to each one of those possibilities. I hope you take something from this video that was both informative and educational and helps you learn a little bit more about yourself and your emotions and things you can do to manage yourself and your emotions so your responses are more based off of rational thought as opposed to emotionally responding. As always, please feel free to jot down any thoughts, questions, or comments you have below. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.